Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. The committee is meeting today to hear testimony on Representative Curtis's bill, H.R. 3397, to require the Director of the Bureau of Land Management to withdraw a rule of the Bureau of Land Management relating to conservation and landscape health. I ask unanimous consent that Representative Dusty Johnson of South Dakota be allowed to participate in today's hearing from the dais. Without objection, so ordered. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chairman and the ranking minority member. I therefore ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted in accordance with Committee Rule 3.0. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Again, good morning, everyone. It's a little bit earlier starting time, but hopefully we'll get out of D.C. a little bit earlier today, and we wanted to have plenty of time for the hearing. We are here today to consider H.R. 3397, which would require the Bureau of Land Management to withdraw its proposed so-called conservation and landscape health rule. In short, this rule would devastate rural economies across the West. Under the guise of conservation, the rule would only further this administration's radical preservationist agenda. More than half of the U.S. population lives within 100 miles of BLM land. Thousands of rural economies depend on access to BLM lands for energy and mineral development, outdoor recreation, timber production, grazing, and more. These activities are all part of the BLM's multiple use and sustained yield mandate, which create hundreds of millions of dollars in economic output and sustain over 783,000 jobs. Now, the BLM is threatening to upend its multiple use mandate and the Western way of life. The rule would broadly allow the BLM to lease lands under new and vaguely defined conservation leases, incorporate new standards when evaluating traditional multiple use decisions, and expedite designations of new areas of critical environmental concern. One of the greatest concerns is how the rule would fundamentally change the way BLM carries out its multiple use and sustained yield mandates by elevating conservation as a use within the Federal Land Policy and Management Act of 1976, also known as FLPMA, thereby bypassing congressional authority. BLM would pursue this through so-called 10-year conservation leases to address restoration of degraded landscapes. And one of the main problems with this is BLM seems to think preservation is the same as conservation, and it's certainly not. This type of playbook is not new for the Biden administration. No amount of clever naming schemes will disguise the fact that their policies are quite simply atrocious. You might recall the 30 by 30 initiative, which was quickly rebranded as the America the Beautiful initiative. We aren't fooled by Trojan horses. The BLM's proposed conservation rule is anything but, and it fails to even define what exactly would be considered conservation or permissible under a conservation lease. While the definition goes so far as to say it will not prevent non-commercial activities, this is in itself limiting because many members of the public access federal lands through commercial outfitting and guiding services, which would by definition be excluded. As a lifelong hunter and fisherman myself, I'm deeply concerned that this will have devastating effects on the outdoor recreation economy, which heavily depends upon outfitters and guides. The rule also states that, quote, lands could be temporarily closed to public access, yet remains silent on how long these closures could last, meaning that the American people could be blocked from accessing an area under a conservation lease for the majority or entirety of the lease's 10-year term. Our committee's members and staff have repeatedly asked the BLM these and many other questions, yet the agency has failed to give us any clear answers on how they will implement this rule. We've held 3 hearings in the past 2 months where members have been able to engage with agency officials on the rule, including DOI Secretary Deb Haaland and BLM Director Tracy Stone Manning. Witnesses have shared their opposition to the implementation of this rule, and members on both sides of the aisle have expressed their concern. The BLM itself has only held 3 in-person listening sessions on the rule in densely populated cities, Denver, Albuquerque, and Reno. These areas do not adequately represent the impacted communities. the agency also failed to respond to a letter I sent with 13 of my colleagues asking them to extend the comment period on this rule and hold more in-person listening sessions. This is why we're advancing H.R. 3397, which would require the BLM director to withdraw this devastating rule and would prevent the BLM from issuing a sustainability or a substantially similar rule in the future. I look forward to hearing our witnesses' testimony and discussion today on why this legislation is so critical to push back on overreaching regulations. American citizens in rural areas across the West deserve better than the BLM's hard-fisted bureaucracy. I'd particularly like to thank Governor Kristi Noem, who's no stranger to this hearing room, having served on the committee before. She's now the governor of South Dakota, as we all know, and Governor Mark Gordon of Wyoming, for traveling to D.C. today to testify on this important subject. And it's great to hear from the real world where these policies will have devastating impacts, and I look forward to getting hearing the testimony of the governors. And with that, I yield back my time and now recognize Ranking Member Grijalva for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chairman Westerman. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about BLM's newly proposed public lands rule, even if I don't appreciate the context in which the discussion is happening. The proposed rule is long overdue. It's a long overdue update to how we manage our public lands. As laid out by the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, FLPMA, BLM has a mandate to manage our public lands for multiple uses in a way that will, quote unquote, best meet the present and future needs of the American people. To meet the needs of our future, there's no question that conservation must be part of that multiple use equation. Unfortunately, however, conservation has historically taken a back seat to all other uses, including mining, oil and gas extraction, and even grazing. These other lands uses have long-standing agency systems and protocols that provide access and set forth consistent guidelines and expectation. Conservation does not. So it's important to see the Biden administration putting conservation on an equal footing and seeking balance. The proposed rule establishes a framework to promote restoration, provide for responsible development, and conserve intact, healthy landscapes. As it stands now, over 90% of BLM lands are open to commercial development. The new rule won't change that at all. But public lands are not just a backdrop for oil rigs and mining pits. They include incredible natural places where Americans hike, fish, camp, bike, or seek respite. Many of the agency's crown jewels are found on the 35 million acres of national conservation lands, places like Bears Ears National Monument in Utah and the Sonoran Desert National Monument in my home state. Conserving these special places is not a radical idea, it's what the American people want. Year after year, Colorado College's State of the Rockies poll shows a broad majority support increased conservation. It's also important to point out that BLM is responsible for managing a countless array of cultural and archaeological resources. That's exactly why tribal communities throughout the country have been calling on lawmakers to support conservation of their ancestral homelands. It's way past time that we start listening. The proposed rule does just that by creating a critical opportunity for BLM to incorporate feedback from tribes and elevate the role of indigenous traditional ecological knowledge into the planning. And finally, I'll point out that the Biden administration is committed to the permitting of 25 gigawatts of renewable energy on public lands by 2025. The proposed public land rule complements that effort by creating a new mechanism for mitigation to occur on public land. Simply put, the proposed rule will help BLM finally establish the balance that will best meet our present and future needs. Repealing this rule only endorses a status quo of imbalance and unsustainability, the burden which our future generations will be forced to bear. I look forward to our discussion today. I welcome our distinguished guests to the committee. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Grijalva. We will now move on to our first panel, which consists of Representative John Curtis of Utah, who is the bill's sponsor. And I now recognize Representative Curtis to testify for 5 minutes on H.R. 3397.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. Thank you to our distinguished witnesses for being here. I'm sitting here and having a hard time, literally having my head not explode. There is one member across the aisle at this hearing at the beginning, and two total at this hearing now. This is the same reflection of those in the East Coast who would like to come to us in the West and tell us how to manage our lands and what's good and bad. Let me state clearly for the record that for decades and decades and decades, the good people of Utah have managed these lands in a responsible way, far better, Mr. Ranking Member, than since the Bears Ears Monument designation. Nothing good has come out of that designation for the land in Utah, for the local tribes, and for the people who participate in this land. And now we have bureaucrats on the East Coast who have never been to my district, who have hardly been to the West other than to fly over it on their way to California, tell us that they know better than we do how to manage these lands. That is simply not true based on any fact. If you come to see these lands, how we have managed them, how we have protected them, how we have taken care of them, how we have balanced recreation with agriculture, with extraction, with the many beauties in this area. So first of all, I would like to go on the record of saying that in the West, we know far better how to manage these lands and have done better for decades and decades than any bureaucrat in the East Coast could ever imagine or ever dream of managing these lands. My district, the bulk of my district is over 90% federal lands. Think about that for just a minute. 90% of my district doesn't get property tax, doesn't have the ability to manage their own fate. 90%. Our state is 60%, and I know our two witnesses have similar percentages in their state. And yet, people from the East who have never been there want to tell us how to manage these lands and what we can do with these lands. And once again, I will say that for decades and decades and decades, the best environmentalists in the world, by the way, they hate to be called environmentalists. Our farmers and ranchers are the best environmentalists in the world, have been taking care of and preserving and protecting these lands. This rule undermines the work of real conservatives, conservationists like farmers and ranchers who've kept the land in good health. It will increase the likelihood of wildfires. Poor management of these lands will increase the likelihood of fires. It will increase our food shortages and our energy shortages. None of these things are good for the people of the United States, let alone the people of the West. The repeal of this designation is critical to proper management of these lands. And I'd like to thank our chairman, our witnesses again, and my colleagues for being here. And I hope that through the course of this hearing today, we will understand truly how to best manage these lands, preserve, take care of our beautiful resources in the West. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield my time.
Thank you, Representative Curtis. We'll now move to our second panel of witnesses, and Governor Gordon, Governor Noem, again, welcome. And I'll just remind you that under committee rules, you must limit your oral statements to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will appear in the hearing record. And to begin your testimony, just press the on button on the microphone. We do use timing lights. When you begin, the light will turn green. At the end of 5 minutes, the light will turn red. I will ask you to please complete your statement if you haven't done so by that time. Now I'd like to introduce Representative Dusty Johnson from the great state of South Dakota to introduce our first witness.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think we all know a lot of politicians who they'll be whatever you want them to be. And if the political winds change, they'll just change who they are just that quickly. And that's not Kristi Noem. I have known her for a long time, and I've seen her act, and I've seen her step forward and make decisions. And time again, I've seen her make decisions not on the basis of what would increase her political comfort, but what would better serve her oath of office. And you guys understand the paradox of that. So often when you make those tough decisions, they end up becoming the popular thing. And in that way, she has led public opinion. And that way, she has made great decisions for our state. And that way, she has been a great leader. So thank you to the committee for letting me show up as an off-committee member, just to show up and brag by saying this. And I'm the only member of Congress who can say this. That's Kristi Noem, and she's my governor.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Congressman Johnson. It is an honor to be here. I was ready for some kind of a joke or something I had to respond to, but thank you very much for that kind introduction. I've enjoyed watching you serve in the seat that represents South Dakota here, and you've done so with distinguished honor. So I appreciate all of your service to our state and our people. Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Westerman and Ranking Member Grijalva and the members of the committee. It's my honor to be with all of you today. In fact, my former Chief of Staff just gave me my old nameplate from this committee when I had the chance to serve with all of you, which is incredibly special to me. I would put it up here today and use it, except for I don't get the chance to sit where you sit today. This is not a decision that I will get the chance to make. This is something that has congressional authority, and you need to act in order to protect our people and to protect our freedom. Today, I sit in front of you as a governor and as a former farmer and rancher and someone who recognizes the deep devastation that if this proposed rule were to go forward, how hard it would be on our people and what it means for our nation far into the future. I remember vividly my time serving here on this committee. And I remember fondly working with many of you who sat on this committee with me as well during that time and the good work we were able to do in preserving our natural resources. Today, as the current governor of the great state of South Dakota, I want to direct my comments specifically to a piece of legislation that you are debating and considering, H.R. 3397. This legislation would require the director of the Bureau of Land Management to withdraw a rule relating to conservation and landscape health. This rule is just one of many that highlights an example of overreaching, unelected bureaucracy attempting to perpetuate radical environmental policies that ignore common sense. They ignore stewardship practices that have been practiced on our land for generations, while allowing multiple uses of this precious resource to strengthen America and our people. We have doing that for many, many years. In my written testimony, which I've submitted today to you, Mr. Chairman, I list several specific reasons why this rule would be so devastating for our people in South Dakota and for our economy. Why I think it is impossible for them to move forward with this and to responsibly conserve our land. I encourage all of you to read that written testimony. It goes into much more detail. In addition to my testimony today, I've joined a letter with other governors, with governors of Utah, Idaho, Montana, Nevada, and my friend sitting here with me today, Governor Mark Gordon of Wyoming. He's a voice, and they all voice concerns with the Biden administration directly on this proposed rule. Like many of you, land conservation for our family isn't just a theory. It's the way that we have lived for many, many generations. I was raised by a dad who often reminded me, Kristi, we don't sell land because God's not making any more land. From the time I was a young girl, I listened to him talk about soil types. I listened to him talk about the importance of native ground, conservation practices, and management decisions. I learned the scientific data and the research of what it took to operate on that land and to protect it, but I also learned why he cared so much. Because working the land wasn't just a job or a career to my father. It was our family legacy. It was our way of life. It was a culture that not only preserves a critical work ethic that is so important to this country, but it also reminded us daily of the natural resources that were a gift from God. As I grew older, I learned more about the importance of keeping all areas of our country productive. To help stabilize the economy, every part of our nation needs to produce, and that would help us during very difficult economic times. I also learned how critical it was to be energy independent, how important it was to protect our nation's food supply and to produce our own food. Now, when I was elected governor, I've selected a fellow rancher as my lieutenant governor. His name was Larry Roden, and to our knowledge, we are the only governor and lieutenant governor in the history of the nation that both spent our lives making a living from agriculture. We're very proud of that, and we understand as well as anyone that our farmers and our ranchers care about our land. They are stewards. We care about preserving it to pass it on to our kids and to our grandkids. My experience in business and in public office and national security issues has reaffirmed my belief that our enemies and those who hate the United States of America may never need to fire a shot to take us over. They may not need to. We are going to be surrendering our freedom by becoming more dependent on them for our critical needs, for gas, oil, food, medicine, and more. When a country controls our food supply and our energy supply, they will control us, and American freedom will be gone. We cannot allow rules like this to move forward in a way that stops productivity and it stops American independence. Nearly 98% of BLM surface lands in South Dakota are grazed by permittees. Grazing is an important conservation strategy in South Dakota. We also host 76 active producing oil and gas wells and 36,762 acres. These acres provide outdoor recreation opportunities, including hunting, fishing, hiking, camping, and more, and we must maintain public access in order for these lands to benefit both South Dakota residents and visitors. Now, Mr. Chairman, I'm smart, and I realize I'm out of time, and you've got a tight schedule. But I've got much more I'd like to share with the committee today on what specifically is wrong with this rule and why it doesn't work, the redundancy in it, the unnecessary burden it creates, how it stops productivity. And the number one concern for me is that conservation is already incredibly a part of every single management practice that happens on BLM land. To go out there and to create a mechanism such as a conservation lease that could be bought by third parties, not even necessarily by people in our own country, and give them access and authority over these lands, it's dangerous. It's not just dangerous to those that are out there working the land. It's dangerous to our economy. It's dangerous to our energy independence, our producing our own food supply. It's dangerous to America. Thank you so much, Representative Curtis, for bringing this piece of legislation. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
Thank you, Governor, and we'll have plenty of time for questions where we'll get to delve into the details of your testimony even more. I now recognize the gentlelady from Wyoming, Ms. Hageman, to introduce our second witness. You're recognized.
Yes, and it's so wonderful to see both of you today. There are a lot of differences between Washington, D.C. and Wyoming, but one of them is traffic. Yeah. Maybe you haven't noticed that. So I apologize for being a few minutes late. It's so wonderful to see both of you here today. Mr. Chairman, it is my honor to introduce from the great state of Wyoming, Governor Mark Gordon. Governor Gordon grew up on a family ranch in Wyoming and understands firsthand the difficulties of dealing with overburdensome federal regulations in a landlocked state. He is an experienced public servant, having served as Wyoming State Treasurer from October 2012 until January 2019, when he was sworn in as our governor. As our governor, he is here today to represent the interests of many frustrated farmers, ranchers, recreationists, and others who have been left out of the conversation on this so-called landscape health rule proposed by the BLM. I would add that this rule isn't about either conservation or landscape health, either one. It is about control. And I look forward to Governor Gordon's testimony in that regard. I ask those of you who consider this proposed rule to be a great conservation effort with minimal impacts to listen to his testimony. Governor Gordon knows Wyoming, and he understands the significance this proposed rule will have on Wyomingites, and many others if we don't do anything about it. Thank you for being here today, Governor Gordon, and I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Representative Hageman, it is wonderful to be here today. On behalf of the people of Wyoming, as a rancher, an outdoorsman, and conservationist, let me thank you for this opportunity to share my support for H.R. 3397, Representative Curtis's bill, and my opposition to the Bureau of Land Management's proposed conservation and land use rule. More than 48% of Wyoming is federal surface estate. The BLM's footprint in Wyoming is substantial, managing approximately 18.4 million acres of public land and 42.9 million acres of federal mineral estate. This equates to over 29% of Wyoming's surface land, covering more than West Virginia. Wyoming's top three economic drivers, energy, tourism, and agriculture, all contribute meaningfully to conservation in concert with the multiple use principle of federal law and BLM's existing rules. Wyoming routinely ranks first in the nation for gas production and second for oil production from onshore federal minerals. In 2022, 7.5 million tourists visited the Equality State, spending $4.5 billion, public land recreation contributes substantially to Wyoming's economy. Agriculture is our third largest economic sector. Grazing on public lands is done under tight regulation and with dedication to stewardship of the land while supporting a domestic food supply. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Wyoming ranchers are custodians of the public lands and work well with agencies on grazing issues. I am proud that my ranch was recognized for excellence in range management by the Society for Range Management. It lies in core sage-grouse habitat. In 2014, my wife and I stood with 8 others when we signed the first candidate conservation agreements with assurances with then Secretary of Interior Sally Jewell. And I remember what she said that day. We have, going on here in Wyoming, the most effective example of state and private landowners working in cooperation with multiple federal agencies to protect these ecosystems in perpetuity. Mr. Chairman, my point is not what we've done for conservation, but the fact that Wyoming ranchers, industries, sportsmen are conservation-minded, and that's true throughout the West. In the words of Teddy Roosevelt, conservation means development as much as it does protection. Wyoming people have respected the importance of conservation from the early days of statehood when we established the nation's first game and fish agency. Respecting private property rights, Wyoming was one of the first states to recognize and implement wildlife migration corridors. We have successfully managed the nation's largest population of greater sage-grouse, and that's because we have the best habitat. Simply put, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The best solution is to rescind this rule. In fact, I question the need to create a separate conservation category. The Federal Land Policy and Management Act of 1976 requires the full consideration of multiple uses of federal lands, as directed by Congress, not the whimsical inspiration of DC bureaucrats. Though the BLM has claimed that there are, quote, pressures to review FLPMA and, quote, fill in the gaps, that is not the Bureau's role. It is up to Congress to write the laws, not the executive branch to take them for a joyride. This proposal wallpapers over federal management grab, which seeks to elevate conservation as a single use on BLM lands. It does so while simultaneously abrogating the BLM's responsibility to review decades of management practices across its 245 million acres and without material stakeholder input. It pits productive uses of public land against conservation, a gross mischaracterization of the concept. Wyoming stands as an example of how grazing, energy development, and recreation are not mutually exclusive of conservation. Wildlife management, moreover, is the responsibility and squarely within the authority and purview of the states, not the federal government. State agencies excel in the management of fish and wildlife species. Yet this rule seeks to circumvent state authority, doing so will throw a monkey wrench into collaborative conservation work that our citizens and state agencies do already with BLM offices. Let me say my administration values the relationship we have with Wyoming BLM staff, which is why it seems so boneheaded to spurn valuable on-the-ground stakeholder knowledge and the ability to work with local partners to craft a useful way forward. One can only assume from broad sweeping statements of this rule that it was pushed from the top down to serve an agenda rather than improve management of the public lands. Finally, Mr. Chairman, the language of this rule inappropriately picks out and expands upon the BLM Organic Act in ways that are arguably unconstitutional. This is not a trivial matter. This rule has the potential to undermine how public lands are managed and threatens the essential economies of my state and our country. Therefore, I urge the BLM to reconsider the need for the conservation and landscape health proposed rule and reiterate my support for Representative Curtis's Bill 3397. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for this time.
Thank you, Governor Gordon, and thank both of the governors for your testimony. I was just thinking how blessed we are to have not only two strong governors from western states here, but two ranchers and two true conservationists. You know, I know a conservationist when I see one, and I see two of them that know what they're talking about at the witness table today. And with that, we're going to move to questions. Members will have 5 minutes. I now recognize Mr. Fulcher for questions.
Thank you, and to our panel, thank you for being here today. I know you got other things to do, but this is real important, and we need you, so thank you for that. Governor Gordon, does Wyoming participate with SRS, Secure Rural Schools funding, payment in lieu of taxes? And can you talk about that and the how that fits into your budget when you put together the budget of each year and the source of that funding? I want to just talk about money, federal money, for just a minute.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, thank you very much for that question. Yes, we do. Mineral development and surface activities there contribute mightily to our schools. Wyoming has a constitution that requires our state to fund a lot of our school activities. There's also local property tax, and we've also funded it with a severance tax off minerals. When we forego that, as we did in 2020, when COVID hit and we shut down production of so much, that was roughly a third of the state's total budget. An incredible hit to local schools, to our school kids, and an incredible hit to our county's ability to meet their needs.
So, Governor, given that, if you had the option as a governor of your state and the ultimate director of that budget, what would you prefer in that dynamic? To control the destiny of the land, to be able to manage that land that is under federal control and these restrictions, or to rely on the ongoing PILT and SRS funding?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, I, as treasurer, had the opportunity to experience what happened when Congress instituted sequestration. As a result, I have recommended that the states collect the federal mineral royalties and distribute the 50% to the federal government rather than the other way around. That money leaving the state and not being able to come back under whatever particular circumstance is dramatic. So to answer your question directly, I would rather control our future than have it controlled by
Thank you for that.
feds.
And Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to state for the record, I wish there were more of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle here, because most of them come from states which are identified as donor states, not donee states, but it's just what the governor pointed out. The amount of federal money that they contribute into their taxpayers pay into the federal government, a lot of that gets exported to the West in the form of PILT, payment in lieu of taxes, SRS. That is a lose-lose deal, because those in those donor states are sending that money to, in large cases, to the West, where there's a lot of this public land, and those of us who are supposedly receiving it are getting the short end of the stick because A, we can't depend on it, it's not predictable. B, as the governor points out, you lose the ability to control your own destiny. Governor Noem, I'm less familiar with South Dakota. I'm right next door.
That's unfortunate.
I'm right next door to
Come
Governor
visit
Gordon.
us.
However, I know Mr. Johnson really well, and he gives me, I've been there, but he gives me all these rave reviews, so I know it's a wonderful
Good.
place. In terms of federal land, do you have a significant issue with wildfire in the summer seasons?
We do, but I would say in the Black Hills National Forest is known as one of the best managed forests in our country. It has one of the last successful operating timber industries, and that is because we utilized some mechanisms that were implemented in the last Farm Bill that I had the chance to work on when I was here in Congress, using good neighbor authority to go out and to do some unique pilot projects to allow us to actually manage our forest in a way that many other people's hands were tied in other areas of our country. So I would say that now we're deeply challenged by what we see coming out of the Forest Service. They're cutting our cubic feet that we can get in timber contracts. In fact, the last GTR made false assumptions and cut our percentage down significantly. I would say a third of what it should be. And that brings incredible risk to our state. I know Governor Gordon and I have worked extensively on trying to get the Forest Service to revise their analysis and use real scientific data to come up with what we could actually go out there and log in order to utilize the timber. But this is the story of it all. We've got bureaucrats in DC making decisions not on facts on the ground, and what it's doing in the Black Hills is it's going to threaten life.
So your point is that the management of the Black Hills
Has been better.
aids the fight against wildfire.
Yes, it does. It aids in the fight against wildfire, and that's because we've been able to go around the federal government.
Thank
We've
you.
been able to get through some of the rules like this one that's being proposed, cut through that and still be able to do more than other forests have been able to. But now we see that going away under the Biden administration. But
Thank you,
listen,
Governor.
these forests are heavily populated with people and communities. When you have a forest fire come through, you're getting more erosion and waste, dangerous chemicals being released into the atmosphere. If a person was environmentally minded and conservation minded, they would allow us to manage these forests.
Thank you for that, Governor. I'm out of time, but that's a very good, thoughtful answer. Governor Gordon, thank you as well. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman from Idaho's time's expired, and I recognize the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gallego, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Westerman and Ranking Member Grijalva. This hearing is another step in the majority's effort to undermine the multiple-use mandate of the Bureau of Land Management and prohibit similar actions in the future. The proposed rule does not change BLM's existing land management planning process. It just adds to it. But this bill would dangerously limit future rulemaking by the agency. As a representative of Arizona, which has 12.1 million surface acres and 17.5 million subsurface acres of BLM land, I think it's important that we look out for the future and not cut ourselves off at the knees by limiting future rulemaking. And I think it's important that these decisions be made based on the input of people who would actually be impacted by this rule. Unfortunately, today's hearing falls short on both accounts. Also, since more than half of this committee's members come from states with more BLM land than South Dakota or other states, we can rely on the experience and expertise of our own governors. I'm also not surprised that many people here have not bothered to actually call some other, apologize. I'm surprised that we have not called other witnesses. Mr. Chair, I'd like to enter into the record, if we can't agree on the fundamental existence of climate change, a productive conversation around the new BLM rule gets a whole lot harder. I'd like to emphasize the importance of inviting witnesses that follow the science and have expertise in the issues we are discussing, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. LaMalfa, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. Appreciate both of you governors for traveling here today and bringing your firsthand expertise on dealing with vast spaces of federal land in your states. Governor Noem, the proposal says conservation leases are not intended to provide a mechanism for precluding other uses, such as grazing, mining, and recreation. Conservation leases should not disturb existing authorizations, valid existing rights, or state or tribal land use management. However, if the administration determines other uses such as grazing and energy production are incompatible with the lease, those uses would not be allowed and could be prohibited indefinitely from these lands, even after the expiration of a conservation lease, which would effectively lock up these lands indefinitely for multiple use. So do we pretty much have a de facto national monument or wilderness area by a designation like this? Do you believe this is their ultimate goal?
It gives them the authority to. This proposed rule absolutely allows them to look at large landscapes and to shut the public out of them, from accessing that, from utilizing it, from no longer being able to hunt and fish, engage in outdoor recreation, from mining, permitting, grazing, all activities. It creates a new mechanism, which I will remind you, Congress has no authority to do this. You're overstepping your authority, or that BLM has no authority to do. Congress is the only one who has the authority to put forward a rule like this to establish something like a conservation lease, which can collect fees to go out and prioritize conservation over all other activities. BLM has no authority to be able to do what they're trying to do in this rule here today. There's no consequences for violation of these conservation leases as well. No punishment if the rules of the game are not followed. What's interesting to me is there's no guidelines on who can purchase a conservation lease and who can't. What's to prevent China from coming in and purchasing up conservation leases on our federal lands and therefore having some control and authority over them? It also allows BLM to go around the NEPA process, which, listen, I'm just a big believer that if Americans have to follow the NEPA process, then the federal government should have to follow the NEPA process. If we're going to go through that, everybody should be treated equally under the law. It's burdensome. It will shut down economic activity in these regions of the country, which right now, facing the inflation and the stagnation that we're seeing, keeping these productive areas contributing to our American energy independence and our food supply is critically important. So it's ill-advised, and what's interesting to me is watching how they allow bureaucrats in DC to make these decisions under this proposed rule and taking that authority away from the local BLM offices, because I think Governor Gordon would tell you, and I will tell you as well, we have good relationships with our local BLM offices because those people actually do live there and they do interact with people that are out there working on stewardship practices on the land. This rule changes that. It takes those decisions away from those local authorities and moves it to bureaucrats within the agency at the higher level that many times may not have stepped a foot in our state.
Thank you. It's apparent to me when I, do flyover country coming from my home in California to
Don't do that. You need to stop.
I don't consider it that. I consider it God's country, but especially at night, once you get west of the Mississippi, there's not a whole lot of lights down there. But I do notice there's a whole lot of problems with the lands that are already managed by BLM or U.S. Forest Service of not having a whole heck of a lot going on in their management. So I wonder, both governors, how do you feel it currently is going with the record of land management that our Forest Service is doing on helping prevent fire? You mentioned the Black Hills there. I look at million-acre fires in my district. What's the track record of them, and should we be giving them more responsibility over more land, such as this pie-in-the-sky 30-30 deal? Governor Gordon, let me give you a shot.
Well, thank you very much, and I'll give you an experience that we had recently in 2020 on something we called the Mullen Fire. It was an area that had been logged before, and is an area that had some burn scars there before as well. It's also an area where there's a wilderness called Savage Run. This lies just a little bit north of the Colorado border. In 2020, we had a serious fire, very dry conditions, and because there was so much dead beetle-kill timber, that fire was almost impossible to put out. It burned for quite a long time. And here's the thing, where it entered into either timber sales that had been harvested or places that had burn scars, the fire was able to be kept at bay. In places where it had old-growth forest, in places where it was a wilderness, that fire escaped all bounds and kept moving. This is very similar to what you had in California.
Yes, sir, like the Tahoe pilot plan that Chairman and I and others have visited, when the fire hits that, you can actually knock the fire down. It actually works. Will not work very well under this rule. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes Ranking Member Grijalva for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Governors. Thank you for taking the time to visit with us today. Governor Noem, welcome back.
Yes, thank you.
It's been a few years since you were a member of this committee, and as you can see, not much has changed. We're still at odds over how best to prioritize long-term conservation of our public lands, and ever struggling to find a common ground on what should be, I would hope, a bipartisan initiative. Both your states, like states all over the country, like my state, are reeling from the effects of climate change. Long-term drought, catastrophic wildfire, and year after year, a record high temperatures, just to name a few. Under Secretary Haaland, BLM has taken the important step to come up with a proposal to balance the uses of public lands, enhance options for durable conservation, and promote resilient and intact landscapes. These are outcomes that are supported by broad majorities of Americans. And as I highlighted in my opening remarks, they are outcomes supported by indigenous communities across this country. The proposal is an opportunity to bring public land management into the 21st century. That's why I believe public land states like Colorado, California, and New Mexico are advocating for the rule. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, New Mexico's land commissioner testified about how the rule is a significant improvement and update to the management framework for public lands. This is a sentiment echoed in a letter sent to the committee by the California Natural Resource Agency, which, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record.
Without objection.
These two states have roughly 10 million more acres of BLM land than your two states combined. So it must be more of a matter of perspective rather than scale or impact. It's not as if California and New Mexico don't have critiques. They are both engaged with the administration to ensure that their concerns regarding the proposal are incorporated into the final product. There's an open comment period. There's still an open comment period, so plenty of time to register official feedback and work with the administration to strengthen the rule. The rule itself is not long. In fact, it may be actually be shorter than your written testimony or the letter the chair referenced in his opening remarks. My comments today are to encourage, to work with the Biden administration to improve this long overdue update. This conflict it's not a conflict, it's a reality, and our public lands should play and need to play a significant role in climate mitigation and to building up resiliency and sustainability for our nation in the long term and for the future. And this rule is future looking beyond our nose and beyond the immediacy of the moment, and a tool that I believe is important as we tackle what I think is the critical issue before us, this committee and Congress and for the nation, which is climate change. Thank you, Mr. Westerman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Stauber, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Governors, it's great to see you. Welcome to the fourth administrative state where unelected bureaucrats make rules that affect us all, oftentimes in a negative way. To me, this is, as Mr. Curtis spoke about, I think this is a way for our federal government to take chunks of land to stop development. You know, in the Iron Range of Minnesota, we have the biggest copper nickel find in the world. It's called the Duluth Complex. Trillions of dollars of minerals there. This administration wouldn't even allow an EIS to go forward. They removed 225,000 acres from development. This is what they're trying to do. And we can talk at these hearings. This administration is going to do what they want to do. I never thought as a member of Congress I would have to vote to defend using gas stoves in our homes across this country. But we did. And just last week, the Army Corps of Engineers removed a water permit that they gave just 4 years ago. The EPA remanded this water permit, first time ever in the history of this country. We feel the pain, and as Mr. Curtis talks about the western states, I want to add the Midwestern states too. This is happening in Minnesota and other states. They would rather push this agenda than allow the American people to live free. As Ronald Reagan says, as government expands, our liberties contract. And as governors, you're seeing that in your respective states. I believe this is another rule and a tool for this administration to assert control and take away our lands from the people of this nation. Mr. Gordon, Governor Gordon, in your testimony, you shared your frustration with the lack of stakeholder input that the Biden administration considered when crafting this proposal. If the BLM actually listened to your constituents in Wyoming, what do you think they would have heard from them on this dangerous precedent that these so-called conservation leases would have on our federal leasing? Would they fear the federal government pairing future productive leases with conservation leases, or utilizing conservation leases to strategically block off other areas from permitted activities? Can you comment on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Representative. A very good question. It is interesting that no one thought to have a field hearing anywhere near my state. And as a result, that testimony is lost on the BLM. I think one of the biggest challenges, and you've mentioned it, is the lack of consistency and the desire by the federal government to kind of control the future of this. Wyoming has a variety of BLM lands. My ranch, for example, has BLM land holdings in it. If those are put into conservation leases, it could quite conceivably affect the way we operate. That could, for many families in Wyoming.
I would submit to you, Governor, that it will.
Yeah,
if this
no,
goes
I
through.
agree with you. And I would also say, Representative, that you could break ranches. You could break families that have been on the ground for generations. And here's the deal. If they weren't focused on sustainability, if they weren't focused on conservation, they wouldn't be in business now. So it would be an irony to say, out of conservation, we're going to break the backs of ranchers who have shown conservation ethic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Governor Noem, it's great to see you once again. And real quick, just like in my district in northern Minnesota, public lands play an important part, a role in your everyday lives of those living in South Dakota. As you mentioned in your testimony, entire facets of your economy are built, both figuratively and literally, on our precious public lands. If this rule is finalized and the BLM gains this tool to weaponize federal lands, what effect is it going to have on your state's economy?
Well, thank you, Congressman, for the question. It'll be dramatic. What's interesting to me is that if you read the rule and the analysis the BLM has put out on the rule, is that they've done no economic evaluation. In fact, they've openly declared that this is not a major rule, does not have more of an impact than $100 million on our economy. Yet, if you keep reading through the rule, they've done no economic analysis and have no idea what the consequences will be if this is put into place. What's also interesting is that there's a real lack of environmental data as well. They don't know how this is going to help, and they make no attempt to even define that our stewardship of the land will actually get better. They openly say that there will be public input, yet do not conduct and follow through on that. Our people have not been heard from, other than the ability to submit comments, which I would say the ranking member referred to people such as land managers and elected officials in some states having an important voice because they're in bigger states. You know, in my world, everybody matters. It doesn't matter if you're big or small or important or not important. You should listen to them, especially if they're making a living off the land. But you have submitted for the record comments from many, many associations of people that engage in recreation, grazing, the Cattlemen's Association, many, many more that have submitted comments against this rule. So I would encourage you to, even though they're not going to conduct public hearings because they don't want to hear what they're going to have to hear, I would say look at those comments that are being submitted to the formal record. And again, in this rule, there's some mechanisms to allow them to stop putting things in the federal record and to stop taking public input at all. Right. So that's another overstep that the BLM made promises years ago that they're trying to do away with in this proposal in front of you today.
Thank you very much, and my time's up. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from New Mexico, Ms. Stansberry, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our governors. Thank you for joining us today. I just want to start with respect to my dear friends across the aisle to counter the narrative that was proposed at the beginning of this hearing that this is just a bunch of bureaucrats from the East supporting this action by the Department of the Interior, and to remind my colleagues that the Secretary of Interior is our nation's very first Indigenous Cabinet Secretary, a native New Mexican whose family has lived in and been from New Mexico for countless generations. And I myself am a native New Mexican. I was born in rural New Mexico, in Farmington, New Mexico, in San Juan County, where my dad worked in the oil fields and where my mom worked at the San Juan power plant. I grew up working the land with my hands, working for my family's irrigation company, and I support this rule. And the reason why I support this rule is because unlike what we're hearing here in this hearing this morning, the rule actually will help us to manage our lands in a more balanced way. It's not going to cut off development. It's not going to cut off our ranchers from grazing. It's not going to cut off oil and gas. It's not going to cut off mining. It's going to make sure that we are adequately balancing the needs of conservation, protecting our cultural landscapes, and ensuring that we are also balancing that with our resource management. And I say that also as somebody from a state in the West that is an oil and gas state, that is a rural state, that is a state where our communities depend on agriculture and ranching, and where our state revenue predominantly comes from oil and gas on those lands, and where our state has actually implemented a very similar rule. And guess what? Not only did it not cut into the revenues of this state, we have seen the largest, most astronomical growth in oil and gas revenues over the last several years in New Mexico ever in the history of our state. In fact, this year, we are on par to see the largest growth in oil and gas revenues after implementing a similar rule. So I find it very upsetting, Mr. Chairman, when I see the resources of this body of Congress, of the People's House, being used to put forward narratives and misinformation that, in my mind, is intended to scare the American people. Because it's just simply not true. And much of what I've heard here today is just not true. This is really about balancing the needs of our public lands. Now, if we want to talk about Eastern bureaucrats who have been misusing public lands, I do have to note, with respect, that the Black Hills were brought up this morning. It is a space that, similar to Chaco Canyon, is sacred to Indigenous people. That is sacred to the Lakota Sioux people, along with places like Mount Rushmore and the sacred mountain that it was carved into, and that the former president, Donald Trump, used for a campaign event, which one of our witnesses helped to host, on these sacred Indigenous lands, which was a misuse and possibly illegal misuse of our public lands. And as we all know, the former president this week was indicted on 37 counts of illegal behavior, including under the Espionage Act. So, it's a fine point to make here in this committee to try to claim that a bunch of Eastern bureaucrats are telling Westerners about misuse of our public lands when the frontrunner in the Republican Party is indicted on 37 counts of illegal activity this week and was misusing our public lands in the West. So I take a lot of homage with the conversation here this morning. So, I do want to make the point that it's important that we follow the science, that we do listen to our stakeholders across the West, that we listen to our Indigenous communities, that we listen to our farmers and ranchers who are stewards of the land, of course they are, that we do work with industry and those who are using our public lands for revenues and for extractive activities that we all benefit from, and that we continue to ensure the ecological integrity of our public lands in the West. But it's also important that we maintain the integrity of this body and use the resources of this committee and of Congress to tell the truth to the American people, and that we make sure that we are serving our role as good stewards of this body and our public lands. And with that, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. I have here in my hand the 88-page BLM rule, and I want to illustrate that this is a substantial rule, much longer than probably all the statements combined that have been made today, and much longer than any letters that we've sent. And without objection, I want to enter this into the record. So ordered. That was not the call of votes, which we do expect to happen here soon. We're now going to go to the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Curtis from Utah. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to explore for a minute this relationship between states with large amounts of federal land in the East Coast, and perhaps help my colleagues understand this relationship. Like both of you, Utah has a large amount of public lands, about 42% just for BLM, about 60% over federal lands. And there were no hearings in Utah on this. And I think that kind of shows the heart of the frustration of those of us in the West. I was on this committee and watched the efforts to move the BLM to the West, to Colorado, successfully started and then pulled back. And really saddened that that wasn't completed because, like both of you, we have great relationships with our BLM folks in the state. We meet with them frequently, we talk with them, they understand our perspective. And so this is not an anti-BLM sentiment from us. It's more of a feeling that people who have not been to our states, who won't hold hearings in our states, who won't come to our states, have a degree of hypocrisy in telling us how to manage our lands. And I'd love to give both of you just a second to comment on that relationship. Governor Gordon first.
Well, thank you. And I think actually the good Congresswoman's testimony, Mr. Chairman, somewhat offended me. We invited Secretary Howland to come to Wyoming to do a couple of things, to meet with the tribes on the Wind River Reservation, which have a long conservation standard, and we've worked very closely with them on a number of issues. We also invited her to go look at the Jonah Field, where oil and gas companies are doing remarkable work to save the sage grouse. She demurred from that and instead went to Yellowstone National Park. And it's very frustrating to me when people aren't willing to look at on-the-ground work. And Chaco Canyon is a great example of where, quote-unquote, conservation has led to amazing amounts of erosion. You know, the other thing that I'm particularly frustrated about on this with the lack of hearings and the lack of process on this is that we have both Governor Polis and I, Governor Polis is a Democrat, have written to BLM and said, can we please use indaziflan to control invasive species? We have yet to see them approve the use of that chemical, which would help with, as you know, cheatgrass and other things. It's ironic because USDA has approved it, the EPA has approved it, and yet they're dragging their feet.
I've got a really important question after Governor Noem answers this that will actually tie into that. So Governor Noem, do you want to respond briefly to this relationship between the East and the North?
Well, it's just, you know, the Congresswoman is wrong in virtually everything that she said. I think that they're trying to cast this narrative that we don't care about the environment or stewardship of our lands, and that we can't work with our local BLM offices. We can. There is the sustained yield is a mandate right now of the Federal Lands Policy and Management Act. So what's interesting to me is that South Dakota is the second largest producing state of renewable energy. That we are regularly in the top 10 of greenest states in the nation, that we are very conservation-minded.
So both of you have led right into the question I want to ask you right now, which is hypothetically, if we could change this and make it outcome-based and say, okay, states, you get to decide the rules of the road, and these are the outcomes we want to produce. We want to make sure these lands are protected. We want to make sure they're preserved. We want to make sure there's recreational opportunities. We want to make sure that any extraction is done appropriately. So here's the rules of the road. And you get to set the terms and conditions. How many of you would like to compete with New Mexico on those terms?
In a heartbeat. We'd beat them every day of the week. You know, that's the reality of it, is because we have less bureaucracy. We did all of these accomplishments and outcomes without mandates. South Dakota doesn't go out there and mandate practices and mandate more taxes to fund government programs to make this work. We do it in partnerships. We have conversations. We have honest, working relationships with the people who live there and recognize the value of the land.
This describes this tension that they feel from us, that they interpret as not caring about the lands. But in essence, it's more, please don't tell us that you know better than we do in a place that you've never been, where, by the way, for decades and decades and decades, we have done a fabulous job of this. And I wish we had more time to explore this relationship, but I think you've spoken well. Give us an outcome-based rule, and we'll take it all day long.
Well, and the one thing that Governor Gordon has mentioned is that this rule also trounces on states' rights.
Absolutely.
Because
totally
it takes decisions
right.
we make regarding our wildlife and how we operate away from us and gives it to the federal government. It is about control.
Yeah.
So regardless of what they say.
I regret I'm out of time. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
When yields back, we'll note that votes have been called, and there's been Well, now 15 people have voted, so I think we've got time for one more round of questions before we recess. Mr. Bentz, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here. So one would think from some of the materials I've read from environmental interests that support this rule that both Wyoming and South Dakota are public lands, wastelands, public land wastelands. Is that the case? Are your public lands in disaster shape that require this type of removal from any type of use to kind of get them back into shape, or are they actually in, what kind of shape are they in? I don't want to lead you any more than necessary.
You know, I would say that there's areas always that can be addressed, but they're managed very well in partnership with the people that are out there operating on the land. And I would say specifically this proposed rule that BLM has brought does no analysis on if these mandates will actually produce better results. That's what's interesting to me, is that what they're putting forward with conservation leases don't show us that it's going to produce better conservation practices or produce greener energy or less carbon emissions. Essentially what it's doing is letting third parties come in, give them some money, and give them the authority over this land rather than the people who actually live there. And it gives no discretion as to who those third parties are. If they are foreign countries, that could be our enemies. They could be people who do not love the United States of America. And then it also allows them to lock up that land and have authority of it that they had no authority before, with no consequences if the agreement is broken.
And Governor Gordon, the suggestion that we need this new use of conservation suggests that multiple use has been a failure. Is that true in your state, or is it working?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Congressman. No, it is not. You know, as the good governor from South Dakota knows, we have worked very collaboratively together to do the best we can with a mosaic of landscape in the Black Hills. Here's one of the problems when it comes to climate change: dead and dying trees off gas because they oxidize. Either they oxidize over decades or they oxidize in a few seconds, as we've seen in the West. You know, the ability to work together on the ground to affect conservation practices, that is the benefit of having local communities and state control. Your comment about does multiple use fly in the face of that? Absolutely not. As I mentioned before, these ranches would not be sustainable. These businesses would not be sustainable if they overuse the resource.
So I grew up on a ranch, and my brothers, 5 younger brothers, 3 of them are still in the ranching business in Oregon, and we're very familiar with this, with what we're debating. I'm also very familiar as an attorney who represented the local Production Credit Association through the 80s and the 90s, just how important a grazing permit is when you go in to get a loan. And you have to say to whoever you're working with, sitting on the other side of the desk, you're trying to get, borrow some money. They ask, well, are you going to have your grazing permit? And you can't say, well, maybe. Is that the case also, Governor Noem, in your state? I mean, isn't that reliability of that which you're going to rely upon to graze your cattle pretty important in those kind of financing conversations?
Yeah, it's an important discussion that everyone has with their bank or whoever is financing them on what their operating note needs to be at what level and what kind of collateral they're bringing to the table, and if their business model actually works. Yes, it is.
And isn't it correct? I'm not sufficiently familiar with either of your states that huge chunks of this public land is already placed in other types of off-limit locations that, like, I don't mean 10 acres, I mean millions. Is that correct, Governor Gordon?
In Wyoming, if you look at the total, it's about 39% of the federal estate that is in either national parks, wilderness areas, other categories of restricted use.
So this proposal of going in and allowing someone to buy up, lease this land, I've heard it said that this is a device to allow people to, big, huge REITs and other organizations with lots of money to come in and bid these things up to acquire carbon credits. And thus all of a sudden this assertion that we heard earlier from New Mexico's Congresswoman that nothing's going to change, nothing could be further from the truth. Is that correct, Governor Noem?
It's very true. In fact, you have a lot of producers out there that may have private land that's completely surrounded by BLM land. What happens if they declare that an intact landscape? that is now locked up and no access given, and they can't even access their own private property. That's a reality that we see out there on the ground that has the potential if this rule goes forward.
Right. Well, thank you both so much for being here. It's an incredibly important issue, and I really appreciate your presence today and your testimony.
And Mr. Chairman, if I might, I want to point out that back in 2008, grazing management that we did sequestered 2,526 metric tons of CO2. We were recognized on the Chicago Climate Exchange. So management makes a difference.
Thank you. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. As I mentioned, votes have been called, so we're going to take a short recess. There are 2 votes, and we'll reconvene approximately 5 to 10 minutes after the second vote. And I hope all the members can come back, and hope the witnesses can stick with us. I apologize for the inconvenience, but we're now in recess.
Nice job.